Hey guys, really quick, before the video starts, I'd just like to ask that you like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps out these videos. We're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by May of next year. Today, Nash is piloting Ognis, a Jund value deck. Nash opened with Bontu Felden, 3 visits, Bolas' Citadel, Urza's Saga, Blood Crypt, and a Swamp. Today, Kyle is piloting Winota, a Boros-based aggro deck. He opened with a Pathway, Windswept Heath, Spectator Seeding, Dranith Magistrate, Vryn Wingmare, Ornithopter, and Sol Ring. Ron is piloting Scarab God, a black-blue reanimator deck. He opened with Gitaxian Probe, Windfall, Toxic Deluge, City of Brass, Drowned Catacombs, Watery Grave, and a Swamp. This week, Ryan is piloting Wyleth, a Boros Voltron deck. He opened with Angel's Grace, Blasphemous Act, Stoneforge Mystic, Knowledge Pool, Swords to Plowshares, Buried Ruins, and a Scalding Tarn. Nash won the die roll and starts things off with a tapped Blood Crypt and passes. Kyle plays Spectator Seeding as his land for turn, and then taps it for a Sol Ring. He then follows this up by playing an Ornithopter and passes. Ron plays a tapped Watery Grave as his land for turn and passes. Ryan plays a Scalding Tarn as land for turn and passes. On Nash's turn, he plays a Swamp. Then Kyle starts his turn off with a Pillar Verge Pathway as land for turn. He then taps out in order to cast Winota. When he attempts to move to combat, Ryan activates his Scalding Tarn, getting a plateau. He then uses the white mana from his plateau to Swords to Plowshares Winota. Kyle then attacks Ryan with the Ornithopter to prove a point. Ron starts things off with a Drowned Catacomb as his land for turn. He then taps out in order to play Prismatic Lens. He follows this up with Gitaxian Probe, paying 2 life and targeting Kyle. Ryan plays a Battlefield Forge as his land for turn and follows this up with a Stoneforge Mystic, getting Swiftfoot Boots into hand. Nash starts his turn off by playing an Urza's Saga. He then casts Captain Lannery Storm and attacks Kyle for 2 damage. On Kyle's turn, he plays a Windswept Heath, getting a plateau. He then casts his Vryn Wingmare. He then follows this up with a Dranith Magistrate. Ron starts his turn off by playing a Swamp as his land for turn. He then pays 2 mana in order to cast Mystic Remora. Ryan starts his turn off by playing a Buried Ruin. He then casts Chromox, pitching Angel's Grace, and then casts Swiftfoot Boots, not paying the Mystic Remora for either, giving Ron 2 draws. On Nash's turn, he plays Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, and then casts Chatterfang. He moves to combat, attacking Kyle with Lannery, causing a trigger to happen, making a treasure, causing Chatterfang to trigger, making a squirrel. Kyle starts his turn off by playing Inkmoth Nexus. He then taps out in order to cast Winota. He then moves to combat and attacks with his Ornithopter in Vryn Wingmare at Ryan, getting 2 Winota triggers. He gets Thalia's Lancer and Ranger Captain of Eos. Off the Thalia Lancer ETB trigger, he gets Rick to his hand, and off the Ranger Captain of Eos ETB trigger, he gets Ragavan to hand. He chooses to attack Ron with both the Lancer and the Ranger Captain. On Ron's upkeep, he does not pay the Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep cost and sacrifices it. He then moves to main phase and plays a City of Brass as his land for turn. He follows this up with a Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life. On Ryan's turn, he casts Wyleth and equips Swiftfoot Boots to him. He then declares attacks on Kyle for 2, causing his commander to trigger, drawing him a card. On Nash's draw step, the 3rd Saga counter is put on Urza's Saga, causing its final effect to activate, tutoring a 1 mana card into play. He chooses Sol Ring. On Nash's main phase, he plays a Rampant Growth, followed by 3 visits. He gets a Zeatora's Proving Grounds and a Mountain. He then taps out and sacrifices both his treasures in order to cast Ognis. He then moves to combat and attacks Kyle, creating a treasure off his commander's trigger. Kyle starts his turn off by playing a Marsh Flats and cracks it for a Plains. He then casts Ragavan, followed by a Mana Vault. He then follows this up by casting Zealous Conscript, stealing Ognis. He then declares attacks at Nash with both Zealous Conscript and Ognis. This causes Ognis to trigger twice, giving him 2 treasures. Ron starts his turn off with a Bloodstained Mire, getting a Swamp into play. He then casts Training Ground, followed by Plague Crafter, and finishes his turn off with a Windfall. On Ryan's turn, he starts things off with a Mountain, followed by a Sol Ring. He then casts Relic Seeker, equips Swiftfoot Boots to the Relic Seeker and declares attacks at Ron. He then searches his library for a Sword of Hearth and Home, putting it into hand, and then he casts Sword of Hearth and Home. On Nash's turn, he pays 6 mana in order to recast Ognis. He then plays a Forest as his land for turn and casts a Loyal Apprentice. He moves to combat, causing his Loyal Apprentice to trigger, creating a Thopter with haste. He swings with Ognis at Kyle and Loyal Apprentice and the Thopter at Ryan, causing 3 triggers on Ognis to make 3 treasures. On Kyle's turn, he plays a Battlefield Forge and then recasts Winota. He uses his 1 remaining untapped land to animate his Blinkmoth Nexus. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Blinkmoth for 1 infect and Ron with Ragavan. He gets 2 Winota triggers. The first one whiffs, and the second one hits Grand Abolisher. Grand Abolisher enters play attacking Ron. On second main phase, Kyle plays a Soul Ring, followed by Remorseful Cleric. He then finishes his turn off by casting Skyclave Apparition, exiling Loyal Apprentice. Ron starts his turn off by playing Sunken Hollow, and then casting his commander, Scarab God. Ryan starts his turn off by casting Pure Steel Paladin. He then follows this up by recasting his commander, Wyleth, and equipping both his Swiftfoot Boots and Sword of Hearth and Home to Wyleth. He then declares attacks on Kyle for 4, getting a Plains off the Hearth and Home trigger and bouncing his Relic Seeker, and 2 draws off his commander's combat trigger. On second main phase, he casts a Weathered Wayfarer and then passes. Nash starts his turn off with the City of Brass as land for turn. He follows this up by Nature's claiming Kyle's Soul Ring. He then casts Wheel of Fortune, and Ron responds by casting Vampiric Tutor. He then casts Oron Frostfang and moves to combat, attacking Ron with his commander and Kyle with a 1/1 Thopter token. Kyle starts his turn off by playing a Mox Diamond, pitching a land to its ETB trigger. He then casts Rionia Fire Dancer, followed by an Enlightened Tutor, putting Ethersworn Canonist to top of his deck. He then animates his Blinkmoth and moves to combat. With the Rionia trigger, he copies his Remorseful Cleric and attacks with all 3 copies and his Blinkmoth, getting 4 triggers on his Winota. He hits Ethersworn Canonist, Loyal Apprentice, Sarah's Ascendant, and Glow Rider, hitting Nash for 10 damage and Ron for 6 and 1 more infect on Ryan. On his second main phase, he bolts in his Shatter Skull the Hammer Pass and passes. On Ron's turn, he plays an island and follows this up with Ashiok Dream Render. He then activates Scarab God, making a token copy of Ornithopter, and then downticks Ashiok to mill Kyle 4 cards. On Ryan's turn, he starts things off by playing a mountain as his land for turn. He then follows this up with an Explorer Scope, which he equips to his commander. He then moves to combat and attacks Kyle for 3. Off the Explorer Scope trigger, he reveals an Ancient Tomb and puts it into play. On his second main phase, he casts Sword of the Animus, followed by Bonesaw. He then equips those 2 to his commander. He then attaches his Sword of Hearth and Home to Pure Steel Paladin and casts Eland Umbra on his commander. On Nash's turn, he plays Assembly Manufacturer. He then moves to combat, attacking Kyle with a Thopter, Ron with his commander, and Ryan with Oron Frostfang. Kyle responds to this by evoking his Solitude. When Solitude ETBs, it puts a trigger on the stack to exile Nash's commander. Ryan responds to that trigger using Deflecting Swat to exile Winona. After all the spells have resolved, Nash gets 3 triggers off his Oron Frostfang and a trigger off his commander, which, with the replacement effect of the Assembly Worker, gives him a food, treasure, and a clue. On second main phase, he casts a Hell Rider and passes the turn. On Kyle's upkeep, Nash channels his Beseiju in order to remove Kyle's Soul Ring. Kyle starts his turn off by casting Professional Facebreaker. He then moves to combat, and using Renona's combat trigger, he copies Professional Facebreaker. He attacks Ryan with the Clone and Nash with the Sarah's Ascendant. Ryan declares blockers with both his Pure Steel Paladin and Weathered Wayfarer, and Kyle gets 2 triggers off the Facebreaker. Ron starts his turn off by casting Deep Analysis and then passes the turn. Ryan starts his turn off by playing Mox Opal, followed by a tapped Sacred Foundry. He then moves equipments around on his creature so that Bonesaw and Sword of Hearth and Home are equipped to his Pure Steel, Sword of Animist, and Expedition Scope are equipped to Relic Seeker, and his remaining Swiftfoot boots is equipped to his commander. He then declares attacks with both his Relic Seeker and Pure Steel. Pure Steel is attacking Ashiok, Relic Seeker is attacking Ron. Ron reanimates Solitude and exiles Professional Facebreaker. He also reanimates Weathered Wayfarer. Ryan, off the Explorer Scope attack trigger, reveals a pathway and puts it into play. Ron then blocks the Relic Seeker and lets Ashiok die. On the second main phase, Ryan casts a Gamble, pitching a Prismatic Vista to its resolution. On EOT, Nash casts an Entomb, putting Anger into his graveyard. Nash starts his turn off with an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. On the start of combat, before attackers are declared, Kyle lightning bolts Nash's commander. Nash then swings all out at Ryan and 1 Thopter at Kyle, causing 3 Hellkite triggers to deal 3 additional damage to Ryan, and giving Nash 4 draws. Before moving to main phase, Ryan Chaos Warps Kyle's Ethersworn Canonist, and then on main phase 2, Nash casts a Demonic Tutor. Nash then follows this up with a Blasphemous Act. Due to the Skyclave Apparition dying, Nash is given a 2/2 Spirit. Nash then proceeds to cast Garn of the Bloodflame. He then casts Arcane Signet, followed by a Nature's Lore. On Kyle's turn, he plays a Lotus Petal. He then cracks it for a mana and taps out in order to play Winota and animate his Blinkmoth Nexus. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan for 1 more Infect, getting a trigger off Winota. On Ron's turn, he recasts the Scarab God and then passes the turn. On Ryan's turn, he moves all his equipments onto his commander and then casts Eidolon of Rhetoric. He proceeds to attack Ron with his commander. Ron responds by flashing out Notion Thief. Ryan reveals a Dockside Extortionist off his Spyglass trigger. On Nash's turn, he plays a Hellkite Charger and swings all in at Ryan. He then pays the 7 mana to get another combat step and repeats this, killing Ryan. On Kyle's turn, he starts things off by playing a Phyrexian Revoker. Ron responds by activating Scarab God, choosing to reanimate Grand Abolisher. Kyle then picks for Phyrexian Revoker to prevent Scarab God from activating. He animates his Blinkmoth Nexus and then moves to combat, attacking with it, getting 1 Winona trigger. He hits Combat Celebrant off the Winona trigger. Ron starts his turn off with a Morphic Pool. He follows this up by casting a Talisman, and then taps out in order to play Nezahal. Nash starts his turn off with a Reckless Fireweaver, followed by an Academy Manufacturer. He then casts a Dockside Extortionist, getting 6 treasures, 6 food, and 6 clues. His Reckless Fireweaver triggers, dealing 18 damage to each player, killing Ron. He then recasts his commander and moves to combat, attacking with everyone, causing him to get 6 more treasures, dealing 18 more damage because of the replacement effect on his Manufacturer, which brings Kyle's life total to 0, and Nash wins the game.